June 12, 1945. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. When the transport trucks rolled through the gates carrying the first group of female German prisoners of war, American guards expected the usual reactions: fear, defiance, perhaps relief. What they didn't expect was what happened in the mess hall that first morning. Obergefreiter Margarete Hoffman stopped mid-step when the scent hit her, her eyes filling with tears. "Coffee," she whispered. "Real coffee." One guard later wrote in his report, "They stood frozen, breathing in the smell like it was oxygen itself." We had no idea what we were witnessing, the moment when hunger met abundance.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
Inside the mess hall at Camp Ruston, the 47 female German POWs faced tables laden with food that seemed impossible. Fresh bread, real butter, eggs, and coffee. Not the acorn substitute or roasted grain mixture they'd been drinking for years, but actual coffee, steam rising from metal cups, filling the room with an aroma that belonged to a different world. Margarete Hoffman, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe communications auxiliary who'd been captured near Bremen, had not tasted real coffee since 1942. 3 years of rationing had reduced German civilians and military personnel to drinking ersatz coffee substitutes made from roasted barley, chicory, acorns, even dandelion roots. The smell of real coffee had become a memory so distant it felt like a dream. But this was real. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the Women's Army Corps officer assigned to process the prisoners, watched the German women's reactions with growing confusion. She'd been briefed on security protocols, medical procedures, and camp regulations. No one had prepared her for this. Grown women, soldiers who'd served in the Wehrmacht auxiliary services, standing motionless with tears streaming down their faces at the sight of breakfast. "What's wrong with them?" whispered Private James Chen, one of the guards. "Are they sick?" Morrison had no answer. She gestured for the women to sit, to eat. They moved slowly, mechanically, as if the food would vanish. When Hoffman lifted her coffee cup, her hands trembled. She brought it to her lips, took a sip, and something inside her broke. The sob that escaped was raw, unguarded, the sound of someone confronting the gap between what they'd endured and what they'd almost forgotten existed. The American personnel exchanged glances. They'd been serving POWs for months, Italian, German, even a few Japanese. They'd seen men surprised by the food quality, grateful for decent treatment. But this was different. This wasn't gratitude. This was something closer to grief.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
What the Americans didn't understand, what they couldn't understand without having lived through it, was the mathematics of starvation that had governed German civilian and military life for the final 2 years of the war. By 1943, the average German civilian's coffee ration had been reduced to 100 grams of ersatz coffee per month, barely enough for 1 weak cup per week. By 1944, real coffee had disappeared entirely from civilian markets. What replaced it was a constantly degrading series of substitutes: roasted grain, then chicory, then acorn flour, then whatever could be roasted and ground to produce a hot, brown liquid that bore no resemblance to actual coffee. The female auxiliaries serving in the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine had fared slightly better than civilians, but not much. Their rations included what was euphemistically called service coffee, a mixture primarily composed of roasted barley with occasional hints of chicory. It provided warmth and a bitter taste that mimicked coffee's harshness without any of its actual properties or satisfaction. But it wasn't just coffee. By 1945, the entire German food supply system had collapsed.
The women sitting in Camp Ruston's mess hall that morning had been living on rations that averaged 1,200 calories per day in the final months of the war, when they got rations at all. Many had gone days without food as the Wehrmacht's supply lines disintegrated. They'd watched friends die not from combat, but from dysentery, malnutrition, and diseases that flourished in weakened bodies. American POW camps, by contrast, operated under Geneva Convention standards that required prisoners receive rations equivalent to U.S. military personnel. For German POWs arriving in American camps, this meant approximately 4,000 calories per day of varied, nutritious food. It wasn't just more food, it was a different reality entirely. The coffee in Camp Ruston's mess hall that morning came from Brazil, shipped to New Orleans, roasted in Louisiana, and brewed fresh every morning. It was the same coffee American soldiers drank, the same coffee served in diners across America, abundant and unremarkable. To the German women, it was evidence of a level of prosperity they'd almost forgotten existed.
Margarete Hoffman's journey to Camp Ruston had begun 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1941, when she'd volunteered for the Luftwaffe Nachrichtenhelferin, the Air Force Communications Auxiliaries. At 24, she'd been a school teacher in Heidelberg, engaged to a Luftwaffe pilot named Klaus, who'd been killed over Britain in September 1940. She'd joined to honor his memory, and because the alternative was conscription into factory work. The Nachrichtenhelferin operated radar stations, radio communications, and telephone exchanges, critical work that freed male personnel for combat roles. The women wore gray-blue uniforms, held military ranks, and faced many of the same dangers as male soldiers, especially as Allied bombing intensified. In 1941 and early 1942, life in the auxiliaries had been tolerable. Rations were adequate. Coffee was still available, though rationed. The war still felt winnable. But by 1943, everything had changed. The defeats at Stalingrad in North Africa, the relentless Allied bombing campaign, the tightening blockade, all of it manifested in shrinking rations and growing desperation. Hoffman had been stationed near Bremen, operating communications equipment at a radar installation. She'd watched the city burn night after night under RAF and American bombs. She'd seen the effects of malnutrition spread through her unit, women who'd once been vibrant and capable becoming gaunt, exhausted, prone to illness. The coffee had been one of the first casualties, replaced by the bitter grain substitute that mocked the memory of the real thing. By April 1945, as British forces approached Bremen, the situation had become untenable. Supply convoys no longer reached them. Their commanding officer had disappeared, presumably fled. When British soldiers arrived at the radar station on April 27th, Hoffman and her comrades had surrendered without resistance. They were too exhausted, too hungry, too broken to do anything else. The British had processed them quickly, then transferred them to American custody for transport to POW camps in the United States. The journey across the Atlantic had taken 2 weeks. They'd been fed aboard the transport ship, plain food, but adequate. It was the first time in months any of them had eaten enough to feel full. But nothing had prepared them for America. June 13, 1945. First full day at Camp Ruston. The second morning at Camp Ruston brought more shocks. Breakfast again included coffee, but also fresh orange juice, something most of the German women hadn't tasted in 5 years. Obergefreiter Anna Weber, a 26-year-old from Hamburg who'd served in the Kriegsmarine Communications Service, stared at the glass of juice as if it might be poisoned. "Is it real?" she asked in halting English. Private Chen nodded. "Florida oranges, fresh squeezed this morning."
Weber drank it slowly, her eyes closed. When she finished, she spoke in German to Hoffman, who translated. She says she remembers oranges. Her father brought them home at Christmas before the war. She thought she'd never taste one again. Lieutenant Morrison made notes in her daily report that evening. The prisoners continued to exhibit emotional responses to standard rations that suggest severe prior deprivation. Medical examinations scheduled for tomorrow to assess nutritional status and health conditions. The medical examinations revealed what Morrison had suspected. Of the 47 female POWs, 41 showed signs of malnutrition ranging from moderate to severe. Their average weight was 15 to 20% below healthy norms for their height and age. Many had vitamin deficiencies, anemia, and dental problems from years of poor nutrition. 3 required immediate hospitalization for more serious conditions related to long-term starvation. Dr. Helen Foster, the camp's medical officer, had seen malnourished prisoners before, but the pattern here troubled her. These women weren't starving because they were POWs. They were already starving before they were captured. This is what the German home front looks like now. Systematic nutritional collapse.
June 20th, 1945. The adjustment period. By the end of the first week, the initial shock had worn off slightly, replaced by something more complex. The German women began to understand that the abundance they'd encountered wasn't special treatment or a temporary show. This was simply how American POW camps operated, how America itself operated. Hoffman found herself assigned to clerical work in the camp administration building, translating documents and helping process newly arriving German POWs. The work gave her access to American personnel and their casual conversations, which revealed a world she'd almost forgotten existed. The secretaries complained about butter rationing, a rationing that still provided more butter per week than Hoffman had seen in a year. They grumbled about coffee shortages, shortages that meant having to drink 2 cups per day instead of 3. They discussed weekend trips to nearby towns, movies, new dresses, things that belonged to a civilian life Hoffman barely remembered. One afternoon, Lieutenant Morrison found Hoffman sitting alone in the office after hours, staring at a copy of Life magazine someone had left on a desk. The magazine featured photographs of American supermarkets, their shelves stocked with abundance that looked surreal to someone who lived through Germany's collapse. "It's hard to believe, isn't it?" Morrison said, sitting down across from her. Hoffman looked up, her English improving daily. "We did not know. We knew America was rich, but we did not understand what this meant. We thought our sacrifices were the same as everyone's. We thought everyone was hungry." Morrison chose her words carefully. "The war reached you differently than it reached us." "Yes," Hoffman said quietly. "It consumed us, and we did not see it happening until it was too late to stop." July 4th, 1945, Independence Day. The camp held an Independence Day celebration, a peculiar event for a POW facility, but Camp Ruston's commander believed in maintaining morale for both prisoners and guards. There was a baseball game, a band concert, and a special meal that included hamburgers, hot dogs, potato salad, and apple pie. The German women watched the festivities with a mixture of curiosity and growing comprehension. The abundance wasn't a show for their benefit. This was simply how Americans lived, even in wartime, even in a military installation in rural Louisiana. The disconnect between their experience and American reality had created a cognitive gap so wide it was difficult to process. Anna Weber sat beside Hoffman during the band concert.
watching American soldiers laugh and joke with each other, eating ice cream as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "We lost, didn't we?" Weber said in German. "Not because of tactics or weapons. We lost because they could do this, throw a party in a prison camp, while we were eating acorn coffee and dying in cellars." Hoffman nodded slowly. She'd been thinking the same thing for weeks. The coffee had been the first clue, but the full picture was becoming clear. Germany had mobilized its entire society for total war, squeezing every resource from its people until there was nothing left. America had fought the same war while its citizens worried about butter rationing and complained about coffee shortages that would have seemed like an abundance in Berlin. The mathematics of the war had been decided long before the battles, decided by industrial capacity, agricultural output, and the simple fact that America could feed its people while Germany could not.
July 15th, 1945. The letters home. The Red Cross had established a mail service allowing German POWs to write letters home through neutral Switzerland. The letters were censored, limited to personal matters, but they provided the first communication many of the women had with their families since capture. Hoffman sat in the camp's recreation hall, trying to write to her mother in Heidelberg. How could she describe what she'd seen? How could she explain the coffee, the food, the casual abundance that surrounded her in this POW camp? She wrote carefully, "I am being treated well. The food is adequate, and I am gaining back my health. I hope you and Father are safe and have enough to eat. I think of you every day and pray for your well-being." What she didn't write: "Mother, they give us real coffee every morning. They give us so much food I cannot eat it all. The Americans guarding us eat better than German generals. We lost not because we weren't brave or dedicated, but because we were fighting an enemy that could wage war without sacrificing everything. I understand now why we could never win. I wish I could tell you this, but they would censor it. And perhaps it's better you don't know. Perhaps it's better to remember me as a patriot who served faithfully, rather than someone who learned too late what we were really fighting against." Lieutenant Morrison reviewed the letters before they were sent. She noticed the careful omissions, the things the German women didn't say. They were learning to live with the knowledge of what they discovered, that their sacrifices had been real but ultimately futile, offered up to a cause that had been doomed not by cowardice or betrayal, but by simple arithmetic. August 1st, 1945. New arrivals. In early August, a new group of German POWs arrived at Camp Ruston, male Wehrmacht soldiers captured during the final battles in Bavaria. They'd been held in temporary camps in France before being shipped to America. Like the women before them, they experienced the shock of American abundance, but with a different edge. The men had been soldiers in combat units. They'd fought, killed, and watched friends die. Their hunger had been a soldier's hunger, bitter but expected. The women's hunger had been different. The slow, grinding deprivation of civilians and rear-echelon personnel who'd watched their country consume itself while still being told victory was possible. Hoffman found herself assigned to help orient the new male prisoners. One of them, a former Unteroffizier named Stefan Richter from Munich, reminded her painfully of Klaus. The same lean build, the same sardonic humor that covered deeper wounds. "Is it true?" Richter asked her in German, his first morning in the mess hall. "The coffee, the food, is this how they always eat?" "Yes, this is normal for them." Richter stared at his breakfast tray. Eggs, toast, bacon, coffee, orange juice. "We were idiots," he said flatly. "We actually thought we could beat them. We all thought that, until we came here and learned what we've been fighting against." August 15th, 1945. Victory over Japan. The announcement of Japan's surrender reached Camp Ruston on August 15th. The war was over. Completely, finally over.
The American personnel celebrated with restrained joy, relief mixed with exhaustion after 4 years of global conflict. For the German POWs, the news carried different weight. Margarete Hoffman sat in the recreation hall with Anna Weber and a dozen other women, listening to the radio broadcast. The war they'd fought was over. The war they'd lost was over. And they were sitting in Louisiana, healthy for the first time in years, drinking real coffee whilst their families in Germany faced an uncertain future under Allied occupation. "What happens to us now?" Weber asked quietly. Lieutenant Morrison, who'd been standing nearby, approached them. "You'll stay here until repatriation can be arranged. Given the situation in Germany, it might be several months, possibly longer." Several months of regular meals, medical care, and relative safety, whilst their homeland struggled with devastation and occupation. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. That evening, Hoffman volunteered to help in the camp kitchen, a privilege granted to trusted prisoners who demonstrated cooperation. Working alongside American cooks, she watched them prepare the next day's meals with an abundance that still startled her. 50 pounds of coffee beans sat in a storage room alongside crates of sugar, flour, canned goods, and fresh vegetables delivered weekly from local farms. The head cook, Sergeant William Torres from Texas, noticed her staring at the supplies. "Something wrong?" "No," Hoffman said carefully. "It's just, this is more food than my entire unit saw in a month, and this is just for 1 day here." Torres considered this. "You know, my wife complains about rationing back home, says it's tough only getting 8 ounces of coffee per week." He gestured at the coffee beans. "I never thought about what it must have been like on your side. No offense, but I'm glad we won. Can't imagine living the way you folks did." "Neither could we, until we had to." September 1945. The adjustment. As autumn approached, Camp Ruston had settled into a routine that would have seemed surreal 6 months earlier. The German POWs, now numbering over 200 with continued arrivals, worked various jobs within the camp: clerical work, laundry, kitchen assistance, maintenance. They were paid in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen for small luxuries: chocolate, soap, cigarettes, magazines. Hoffman had become an unofficial liaison between the German prisoners and American administration. Her improving English and willingness to cooperate made her valuable to both sides. She helped translate, mediated disputes, and gradually became someone both groups trusted. One afternoon, she was summoned to the camp commander's office. Colonel Robert Harrison, a career officer who'd overseen the camp since its establishment, wanted to discuss a proposal. "Lieutenant Morrison speaks highly of you," Harrison said, gesturing for Hoffman to sit. "She says you've been helping to orient the new arrivals, particularly the women. I'd like to formalize that role. We're receiving more female POWs, and frankly, my staff doesn't always understand what they've been through. You do." Hoffman listened as Harrison outlined the proposal. She would help develop orientation programs for new arrivals, work with the medical staff to address the specific health issues facing female POWs, and serve as a bridge between the prisoners and administration. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care about making this better for us? We were your enemies." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "The war is over. You're not enemies anymore. You're people in my care until you can go home. And from what Dr. Foster tells me, what you folks went through before you even got here was rough enough. No point making it worse." It was a peculiarly American attitude, Hoffman thought. Practical, optimistic, with an assumption that problems should be solved rather than endured. She accepted the position.
October 1945. Letters from home. The first substantial batch of letters from Germany arrived in October, nearly 4 months after the women's capture. They painted a grim picture. Hoffman's mother wrote from Heidelberg, describing life under American occupation. Food shortages continued, though American relief efforts were beginning. The city was damaged but not destroyed like Hamburg or Berlin. Her father had survived but was in poor health. They were managing. Reading between the carefully worded lines, Hoffman understood. Her family was struggling, hungry, living in the ruins of a defeated nation, whilst she sat in Louisiana eating 3 meals a day and drinking real coffee. The guilt was crushing. Anna Weber received news that Hamburg, her hometown, had been largely destroyed by firebombing. Her family's home was gone. Her mother and sister had survived and were living with relatives in the countryside. But her father had died during the bombing in 1943, a fact she was only now learning 18 months later. Weber read the letter silently, then folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. She walked to the mess hall, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat alone at a corner table. Hoffman watched her from across the room, recognizing the peculiar torture of surviving in abundance whilst those you loved suffered in deprivation. That evening, Hoffman found Weber in the barracks, staring at the letter. "My father has been dead for 2 years," Weber said flatly, "and I've been eating eggs and drinking real coffee in America." "It's not your fault," Hoffman said quietly. "I know that, but knowing it doesn't make it easier to swallow the eggs tomorrow morning."
November 1945. Thanksgiving. The camp held a Thanksgiving celebration in late November, another peculiar American tradition that the German POWs struggled to understand. The concept of setting aside a day to give thanks for abundance struck them as almost obscene, given what they knew of the world beyond the camp's fences. But Colonel Harrison insisted. "Part of being in America," he told Hoffman when she questioned the decision, "is learning what America is about. And this, gathering together, sharing food, being grateful for what we have, this is part of who we are." The feast was elaborate by any standard. Roasted turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. For the German POWs who'd been at Camp Ruston since June, the abundance had become almost normal. For newer arrivals, it was another shock to absorb. Hoffman sat at a long table with Weber, Stefan Richter, and a dozen other German POWs, eating food that still felt like a dream despite months of regular meals. Across from her, a newly arrived Wehrmacht soldier named Otto Kraus stared at his plate with the same expression she remembered from her first morning in the mess hall. "Is it always like this?" Kraus asked. "Yes," Hoffman replied. "Every day. You'll get used to it." "I don't want to get used to it," Kraus said bitterly. "My brother died outside Stalingrad eating frozen horse meat. My mother is in a refugee camp somewhere in the east, and I'm sitting in Louisiana eating turkey and being told to be grateful." Weber spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Your brother would want you to eat the turkey. Your mother would want you to survive. The war is over, and being miserable here doesn't help anyone back home." It was a hard truth that all of them had learned in different ways over the past months. Suffering in sympathy with those who still suffered accomplished nothing. The best they could do was survive, maintain their health, and wait for the chance to return home and rebuild.
December 1945, Christmas preparations. As Christmas approached, the camp began preparations for holiday celebrations. The American staff decorated a large tree in the recreation hall, and the Red Cross organized care packages for prisoners to send home, small boxes containing soap, chocolate, canned goods, and other basics that were precious commodities in occupied Germany. Hoffman spent hours helping German POWs write messages to accompany their packages, translating their careful words into English for the censors. The letters revealed a common theme. "We are well treated. We have enough to eat. We think of you constantly. We pray for your safety and health." What they didn't write, what the censors would have deleted anyway, "We feel guilty for every meal. We dream about your hunger. We can't reconcile the abundance here with the deprivation we know you're enduring."
Lieutenant Morrison found Hoffman in the administration office on Christmas Eve, working late on translation duties. "You should rest," Morrison said. "Tomorrow is Christmas." "I know. I'm almost finished." Morrison sat down across from her. "Can I ask you something? And please be honest. It's not for any report, just personal curiosity." Hoffman nodded. "How do you do it? How do you live with knowing what your family is going through whilst you're here, safe and fed?" Hoffman considered the question carefully. "I remind myself that my suffering here would not ease their suffering there. I remind myself that staying healthy means I'll be able to help them when I finally go home. And I remind myself that understanding what we saw here, understanding what we were really fighting against, that knowledge has value too." "What do you mean?" "We were told many things during the war. About America, about why we were fighting, about what victory would look like. But sitting here, eating real coffee and watching Americans complain about minor inconveniences, I understand now what we never understood then. We were trying to fight a country that could wage war without destroying itself. That's why we lost. Not because we weren't brave or dedicated, but because the arithmetic was impossible." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "And that helps?" "It helps me understand. Understanding doesn't ease guilt, but it provides context. And context is something."
January 1946, the documentary. In January 1946, a team from the Army's Signal Corps arrived at Camp Ruston to film a documentary about POW operations. They interviewed German prisoners, filmed daily routines, and documented the conditions in which former enemy combatants were living. Hoffman was selected as one of the interview subjects, largely because of her improved English and willingness to speak candidly. The interview took place in the administration building, with bright lights and camera equipment that felt surreal. "Tell me about your experience here," the interviewer, a young lieutenant named David Cohen, asked. Hoffman spoke carefully, aware that her words would be preserved on film. "When I first arrived, I could not believe the food, the coffee especially. Real coffee, not the substitutes we'd been drinking for years. It was shocking to discover that America could fight a global war and still have fresh coffee every morning." Cohen leaned forward. "Were you aware, during the war, of the economic disparity between Germany and America? We knew America was wealthy, but knowledge is abstract. Seeing it, smelling the coffee, tasting real butter, that made it concrete. We understood then that we'd been fighting a war we could never win, not because of tactics or bravery, but because of resources. America could afford to treat its prisoners better than Germany could feed its own soldiers." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone involved in the filming. Here was a former enemy speaking on camera about how American abundance had demonstrated the impossibility of German victory. The documentary would be shown to American audiences as evidence of proper POW treatment, but the subtext was darker. It was a portrait of what happens when a nation exhausts itself in total war against an enemy that never had to make the same choice. The Signal Corps team spent 2 weeks at Camp Ruston, documenting everything from mess hall operations to medical care to recreational activities. They filmed German POWs playing volleyball, attending English classes, working in various camp jobs. The footage showed healthy, well-fed prisoners in clean uniforms, living in conditions that were Spartan but adequate. What the cameras couldn't capture, was the psychological complexity of the prisoner's situation, the guilt of surviving in comfort, the relief of being safe, the grief for what they'd lost and what Germany had become, the strange gratitude mixed with resentment at being treated well by the nation that had defeated them.
March 1946. Repatriation plans. In March 1946, the first groups of German POWs began the process of repatriation. Priority was given to those with families in the Western occupation zones, where conditions were slowly stabilizing under American and British administration. Hoffman learned she would be in the second group, scheduled for departure in May. The news brought relief mixed with apprehension. After nearly a year at Camp Ruston, she'd adapted to American abundance. The transition back to a Germany still struggling with food shortages, devastation, and occupation would be jarring in the opposite direction. Colonel Harrison called a meeting for prisoners scheduled for repatriation, outlining what they could expect. "Conditions in Germany are improving," he said, "but they're still difficult. The occupation authorities are distributing food aid, but rationing continues. You'll find that life there is harder than it is here. I want you to be prepared for that." Prepared. How could one prepare for such a transition? From abundance back to scarcity. From the surreal comfort of captivity back to the reality of defeat and occupation. That evening, Hoffman and Weber walked the perimeter of the camp, as close to the fences as prisoners were allowed, talking about what awaited them. "I'll miss the coffee," Weber said. It was both a joke and a truth. "So will I," Hoffman admitted. "Strange, isn't it? We'll miss coffee from a prison camp because it's better than anything we'll find at home for years." "Everything here has been like that," Weber said. "Better food, better medical care, better treatment than we gave our own people towards the end. It makes you wonder what we were fighting for." Hoffman had been wondering that for months. The propaganda they'd been fed during the war, about strength through sacrifice, about the nobility of their cause, about inevitable victory, all of it crumbled when confronted with the simple reality of American abundance. Germany had asked its people to sacrifice everything for total war. America had fought the same war whilst its citizens complained about minor rationing. The lesson was inescapable. Total mobilization was not strength, it was desperation. True strength lay in being able to wage war without destroying the civilian economy, without starving your own people, without consuming the nation itself in the process.
May 1946. Departure. On a warm morning in May, Hoffman and 150 other German POWs boarded transport trucks for the journey to New Orleans, where they would ship back across the Atlantic to Europe. Nearly a year after her arrival, she was leaving Camp Ruston with better health than she'd had in years, carrying a small bag of personal items and a mind full of lessons she'd never expected to learn. Lieutenant Morrison came to see her off. The two women had developed a mutual respect over the months, grounded in honest conversations about the war, suffering, and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. "Take care of yourself," Morrison said, "and when you get home, remember that reconstruction is possible. Germany will recover." "Will it?" Hoffman asked. The question was genuine, not rhetorical. "Yes," Morrison said firmly. "We're going to help make sure of it. That's the point, isn't it? To build something better than what the war destroyed." On the transport truck, watching Camp Ruston recede into the distance, Hoffman thought about that conversation. Building something better. It was an American sentiment, optimistic, forward-looking, assuming that problems had solutions rather than being permanent conditions of existence. The journey back across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. The ship was crowded, the accommodations basic but adequate. The German POWs aboard carried stories similar to Hoffman's, months or years in American camps, experiencing an abundance that had revealed the true mathematics of the war they'd fought. When they finally arrived in Bremerhaven in June 1946, the contrast hit immediately. The port was damaged, though partially rebuilt. The people they saw on the docks were thin, gray-faced, moving with the deliberate slowness of those conserving energy because calories were precious. Germany was surviving, but barely. Hoffman's mother met her at the processing center in Heidelberg. They embraced, and Hoffman felt her mother's thinness, the sharpness of bones that shouldn't have been so prominent. In that moment, all the guilt of the past year crystallized into overwhelming grief. "You look healthy," her mother said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God you look healthy." "I'm sorry," Hoffman whispered. "I'm so sorry I was safe whilst you were here." Her mother pulled back, holding Hoffman's face in her hands.
Don't apologize for surviving. Don't apologize for being fed and cared for. The war is over. We're alive. That's what matters now.
In the years that followed, Hoffman would think often about her time at Camp Ruston. The coffee became a symbol in her memory, not just of American abundance, but of the moment when she understood the true nature of the conflict she'd lived through. Germany recovered, slowly, with American aid through the Marshall Plan. Coffee returned to German tables, though it would be years before it was abundant and affordable. Hoffman eventually found work as a translator, using the English she'd learned as a POW to facilitate communication in the rebuilding efforts. She married in 1948, not Stefan Rector, though they'd corresponded for a time, but a local teacher named Wilhelm, who'd also served and survived. They had 2 children and built a quiet, ordinary life in post-war Germany. But she never forgot the smell of that first cup of real coffee in the Camp Ruston mess hall. It had represented more than just the end of deprivation. It had been the moment when abstract knowledge became visceral understanding, when she'd truly comprehended what Germany had been fighting against and why the outcome had never really been in doubt. The lessons stayed with her, influenced how she raised her children, how she spoke about the war when asked. War is not won by sacrifice alone. It's won by the side that can sustain itself while still waging the conflict, the side that can feed its prisoners better than the enemy feeds its soldiers, the side that can have fresh coffee every morning whilst fighting on 3 continents. It was a hard lesson, learned in the strangest of classrooms, a POW camp in Louisiana, where former enemies discovered that abundance, not deprivation, was the true measure of a nation's strength in total war. And sometimes, late in life, when she drank her morning coffee in her Heidelberg apartment, she would remember that first cup at Camp Ruston, and the tears it had brought, and the understanding it had represented. The memory was bittersweet, like the coffee itself, a reminder of suffering, survival, and the peculiar education that comes from experiencing the full measure of one's defeat through the simple generosity of one's captors.